Before we begin this episode of Shadiversity, I just want to take this moment to offer a heartfelt and sincere thanks to my patrons on Patreon, because it is due to them that I'm able to make videos like this one that you're about to watch. You see, this video actually took the equivalent of a full working week to produce. And putting in so much effort to a single video doesn't leave me any time to make a second video during that week, which honestly hurts me regarding YouTube views and channel growth. And this is what my patrons are able to do for me, because thanks to their support, I can take that kind of hit and, just get through the lower amount of views I will have to get when I make a single video for a week that requires more work. Due to their support, it is massive. It means so much, and I really do thank you guys. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I put a lot of effort into it, and if any of you would like to support Shadiversity to help me continue to make the best videos I can make, it'd be awesome if you could consider supporting me on Patreon. $1 a video? That would be phenomenal. Yeah, but what about dragons? Fade away. Good question.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and let's talk about the inside of medieval castles, specifically the type of rooms that you would expect to find. Now, thanks to fantasy and pop culture and such, castles can be very misunderstood things, when in reality most castles were much smaller. In fact, there was a very large majority of them that really only had 1 to 2 rooms inside. And when I say small, I'm being serious about that. There are many castles that are technically just watchtowers, but because someone's living in them, they're a full-fledged castle. And over half the castles built within the entire breadth of the medieval period are actually made out of wood, or a composite between stone and wood. Well, with those misconceptions, here's another one to clear up, and it's that many people believe that castles are supposed to have certain rooms. For instance, the throne room. All castles are supposed to have a throne room. And many of the other classic iconic rooms that you think castles are supposed to have, say, like the dungeon, no. The way to get a good baseline for the minimum requirements as to the type of rooms you would expect to find within a real, historical, medieval castle is to understand what a real medieval castle was, which is a private fortified medieval residence, with exceptions of course. Not every structure that is identified as a castle within the medieval period falls into this strict definition, but most do. So the first and primary part of this is, of course, the residence. And what is the minimum requirements for a medieval residence? Well, basically, it's a single room. So what I'll do in this video is kind of start at the minimum requirement and then build our way up, kind of expanding upon this castle concept, which as it gets bigger, we have the opportunity to add more rooms in, and as we do that, I can identify to you what the most common type of rooms that you would expect to find within a medieval castle, depending on its size. Because size really is the most determining factor in this consideration. So now let's go back to the minimum requirement, which, like I said, is a single room. Within this room, you would expect to find a hearth to be able to cook, a bed to sleep in, which would probably be double size for the whole family to sleep in. Having an individual bed for every individual person is quite the, extravagance, but once we get rich enough and the castle gets big enough, that's maybe an extravagance that we can afford. But in this minimum level, no, single bed, that'll do the job. A table to eat at, also very useful. And then separate to this, maybe a chest of some kind for storage. You have to understand that in the medieval period, people didn't spend a lot of time indoors. Of course, that certainly changed during the winter time, but still, even during the winter time, there's a lot of work that you need to do outside. A home was primarily for shelter during the nighttime and when it was cold. In regards to what you would expect to find on the outside, I'll only briefly touch on because that's not necessarily the subject of this video, but there are a couple of essential things that you would need to help sustain this home. That being a place to store food, and it could actually be on the inside of the castle if there's enough room, a place to store firewood ready for the winter, and a place to keep your animals. And for food, you certainly need it to be in shelter, and regarding animals and firewood, that helps to have shelter for those as well. And if you have those things covered and your main personal shelter is fortified and defensible, you do have a legitimate medieval castle in its most basic iteration. And there are many real medieval castles that we've identified identified that are as basic as this. Many didn't even have walls around them, but if you add an additional wall around that keep, well, you've just added the defensive ability, because now those things that are sitting on the outside, like your food, firewood, and animals, have proper protection as well. A good water source is very important, and this can be via well or a nearby lake, river, stream, whatever. Regarding a place for you to go do your business, when nature calls, you don't actually need a toilet within or even in the direct vicinity of your castle, because if there's a nearby stream, you can go and do your business there. But if you don't have access to anything like that, a simple hole in the ground will do the job for you, kind of like the classic drop dunny. And then you could work up from there in terms of levels of luxury. For instance, having a shelter over the place where you need to do your business, very helpful and beneficial, especially when it's raining or particularly cold, and then moving it in to where you actually sleep and live, an additional luxury. It's not necessary, but that's one of the first kind of things you can consider when adding onto your castle, a toilet. So then, if you had additional money, resources to build a larger castle, what are some of the other rooms that you'd want to add in? First of all, you might not necessarily actually want to add anything to the keep itself just yet. There are other external buildings that you'd probably want to cover first, for instance, a stable. You have shelter for your animals, but having a more dedicated shelter for your more expensive animals, like your horse, that's a fairly good investment. But now, looking back to the keep, one of the first kind of additions that you want to add is a separation in functionality, because this single room is kind of doing all the jobs that you would need your home to do. It's your kitchen, it's your bedroom, it's your dining area, and it's also the place where you receive guests and visitors. And so the first separation can be any number of these things. You can separate a room to just have the hearth, kitchen, and the bedroom, and then have the dining and visiting area separate to that, which would essentially kind of make it the most basic type of hall that you would have on a castle. But you can kind of mix and match these functionalities. Instead of having the hearth in with the bedroom, which you would kind of want because of warmth, you can separate it so the hearth is in the dining area, where when you receive guests you have warmth, but then you might want to add in an additional fireplace for the bedroom. This simple division in the functionality of the single room into two is actually already quite the extravagance, and it can create a bit of separation between the lord and his servants, guests, and whatever, where they are allowed into the public area, which is kind of the small grand hall that they have on this castle, but they're not allowed into the lord's bedroom. In fact, this basic separation between the lord's private part of the castle and the part where he receives his servants and vassals and such is one of the more basic and fundamental designs of many castles that have this advanced step above just being really a single room, having this division. And there are many arrangements in castle designs which handle this, where the hall, the entry part where they're receiving guests, is expanded and becomes much, much larger. Their own bedroom doesn't need to be massive, but if they're going to be raising a family, it will help to have a little bit of a larger space for their spouse and children. And then the next stage to this is to separate the kitchen from wherever the kitchen just so happened to be located. If it was in the bedroom or the great hall, a separate section where, if you're wealthy enough to have a cook, where they can work and prepare the food. And then in addition to this, if you have a separated garderobe, which is the medieval toilet, you have a fairly decent castle. And remember, this most basic level is also acceptable for many of the early medieval kings as well. Don't think that it was only poor lesser lords that had these types of castles. No, perfectly fine for many kings as well. There is an additional function in some of these rooms that people might not fully realize. For instance, the hall or the public section of the castle. This would be the main dining room, so the lord would eat here with whichever servants are privileged enough to eat with the lord. If the king had his own personal retainers, and this can be 1 or 2 soldiers, and of course they would also be considered knights, depending on situation, but just 1 or 2 to even up to 5, 6, and 10, they would generally eat in the Great Hall with the king, dependent on how rich high up the king is and how much of a class distinction there is between the lord or king and certain types of servants. And then after eating, this room would also function as the guest room. Collapsible kind of cots, which could be set up temporarily, would be brought in, and this is where the retainers would sleep, which kind of makes this Great Hall the barracks, essentially, of this basic type of castle. and it's also the guest room for visitors. When the castle grows large enough to be able to accommodate additional rooms, there isn't a strict set list of, well, you'd most certainly want this room next. It would really come down to the personal preference of the Lord as to what type of room he would want added onto. And out of the list of the common types of rooms that you could find in the castle that would logically be added at this stage of expansion would be, say, a chapel, if it was particularly important to the Lord, because one Lord might want a dedicated chapel for this space that he's able to accommodate for it, or he might want what is called a solar. A solar is an interesting kind of division in functionality once again, where before, when we were looking at the smallest type of castle, a single room had the functionality of everything, and then as we expanded upon that castle, there was no separate area distinct from the dining room where the family could spend their personal time other than the bedroom. A solar is essentially the medieval equivalent of the lounge room. This is the place where the family simply spends their time, and it's actually quite common for a bed to be located within the solar even if they have a dedicated separate bedroom on top of that. Now, depending on the available room that you have within the castle, the chapel doesn't need to be located within the keep. There are many cases where dedicated chapels were built in a separate building to the keep within the bailey, meaning the external walls of the castle itself. Also, as the Lord's wealth to build a larger castle increases, also increases the probability that the external bailey will probably have more room within it as well, which gives the opportunity to build a separate dedicated barracks for the retainers to sleep in, which means they might not necessarily be sleeping within the Great Hall for a castle of this size. And this also applies to any permanent servants that were serving the Lord. Now, what type of servants could the Lord have? Well, that would largely depend on the preferences of the individual Lord and what type of servants they would want over another. Do they want a permanent dedicated cook? Do they want a chamberlain to handle the affairs, the finances, the hiring and firing of staff? Though generally that would be handled by the Lord's wife. But if the Lord's wife was wanting to dedicate her time to other pursuits, well, a chamberlain might be a good idea. The interesting thing about servants within a castle is that they kind of fulfill the same dual purpose as we see the rooms within a castle, depending on the castle's size. The smaller the castle, the more jobs you would expect the individual servants to fulfill. For instance, the cook could also fulfill the role of the scullery maid, who is basically the cleaner of the castle. They also might fulfill the role of a livery maid to help the lady dress and undress. The retainer might also fulfill the role of a manservant to help the lord dress. They even might fulfill the role of a squire, and the squire is there, of course, to help the lord get in and out of his armor and do many other jobs, as well as being trained in the knightly arts. And the squire himself can be fulfilling many additional roles that other servants could have filled if the lord had more money to hire additional servants. Because the more wealthy the lord is, the more prestige he has, the more prestige his closest servants are, to the point where his squires would be treated as kind of lords in and of their own right, with their own servants. And this, of course, depends on time period and geographical location, because the medieval period was a very diverse thing. And depending on how many servants the lord has, also helps determine if there needs to be a dedicated sleeping quarters for them within the castle or within a building external to the keep yet located within the castle walls. If there's no dedicated sleeping quarters, the servants, well, guess what? They would sleep within the Great Hall just like the retainers would. But as the castle increases in size, there can be a dedicated servants' quarters within the castle itself, and this can be a single room with several servants sleeping within it. This servants' quarters would usually always be located close to where they would be doing their work, for instance the kitchen, but an important distinction between the servant sleeping quarters and the lord's sleeping quarters. Maintaining the separation of class was a significant thing in the medieval period. So at the moment we kind of have a castle with a dedicated Great Hall, which also functions as the main dining room and also guest room, a kitchen with possibly servants' quarters adjoining it, storage rooms, garderobe, the main bedroom for the lord and his family, and a separated kind of living room known as the solar. Here we have a very legitimate and what would be considered generously sized medieval castle. Many of the standard medieval castles are actually even smaller than this, with only 2 to 3 rooms, and that being what we were looking at before: Great Hall, a bedroom, maybe a kitchen, possibly storage as well. Most medieval castles are actually as basic as this, and on the larger end of the spectrum we have the castle where the function of those rooms have been kind of separated into additional rooms. rooms. The best example I can give that this castle that we're looking at here is actually on the larger end of medieval castles is by looking at the White Tower itself, the place where many an English king has lived in the past. Here I have imported a model of the White Tower from the SketchUp warehouse, and then scaled it to size off one of the floor plans I was able to find on the internet. And consider this, the White Tower is regarded as one of the very largest castle keeps of medieval Europe. But that's more so in regards to the early and high Middle Ages, because in the late Middle Ages, castles did get bigger. Still, it was rare and exceptional to have a keep bigger than the White Tower as we see here. And in comparison to the castle that we've been able to see grow in this video, the White Tower is only 40% larger, and it is one of the biggest. And then the next thing that we can confirm by looking at the White Tower is how the internal divisions work, because you will notice that they're very basic and very similar to the divisions that we're able to put on the castle featured in this video. The White Tower is divided into 3 sections on 4 consecutive levels. The lowest level, or undercroft of the keep, was used for storage and as a dungeon, and even in some cases, a torture room. The next floor, which was the only entry point of the castle when it was originally built, because of course this keep has changed over time, well, this floor was actually kind of the barracks of the castle. This is where the castle's garrison lived, and it was a very defensible feature because that meant anyone trying to get to the lord had to actually fight through a barracks or garrison of men located right here. There is also speculation that a forebuilding, kind of like a small barbican or entry hall, was actually fixed just outside this door entry, but it's no longer there. I expect there would have been something like that just to add an additional defensive feature to the entry point of the keep. The only access to the upper kind of livable portion of the keep was through this barracks at this stairwell. The next floor of the keep has an inbuilt chapel, very common. The next sectioned off kind of room on this floor was where the court was held, while the main room, this larger part here, was the banquet hall. And this right here in and of itself is actually kind of an extravagance, separating those two functions, where on many other castles, the banquet hall could easily be located within the great hall itself. Additional spiral staircases started on this floor as well, leading up to the floor above. The third and final floor of the keep is interestingly far more basic than people really would have considered that a king would want. First of all, there is kind of a hallway that rings the external barrier of this upper floor. This is actually a defensive feature, giving access to all the arrow loops that circle the keep itself. There's kind of like a void in the floor to the chapel beneath. This section of castle is kind of like the personal council chamber for the king, while the one underneath it was his private living quarters. Essentially, the king only had one private personal room within this keep where his whole family would live, and that is the whole internal layout of the White Tower. This was the actual residence of many a medieval king, and what's so interesting about it, it is far smaller than many people realize. Now, of course, you have to understand, as the kings of England grew in wealth, additional buildings were built around the White Tower, enabling it to house more servants, more soldiers, more guests, and more rooms for the use of the king and his family. But when the keep was the sole main primary building, this is what they had. Was this the largest type of castle within the medieval period? Not at all. Castles, of course, were able to come even larger, but they start to become the minority in terms of what was a standard medieval castle. And what rooms would you expect to find in castles even larger? Well, it's just an additional separation and also duplication of the type of rooms that we already have. A second bedroom, a third bedroom, and maybe even a guest room so visitors don't need to sleep within the Great Hall on temporary beds. More servants' quarters, separating the dining function from the Great Hall so you have a dedicated banquet hall and a Great Hall like what we saw in the White Tower. A dedicated guard room, a schoolroom where the children receive their lessons from their tutors separate from having them done inside the actual bedroom of the Lord. A dedicated bathroom, and when I say that I mean a medieval type of bath room, a room where the baths are located. Because, of course, as the kings got richer and richer, their castles got larger and larger, but these are only the castles of the kings and the most wealthy lords. The castles of the average lord in the medieval period, even towards the late medieval period, were still in a much more modest size. And then the homes of the most wealthy kings started to get so large and lose their military fortified functional purpose to the point that they evolved into palaces and they weren't castles anymore. Although some palaces were built in kind of like a castle Victorian neo-Gothic style, but that of course was after the medieval period. And of course we should remember that these castle-like palaces are not properly fortified, they're not military structures. And in this sense they are not the same type of castle as the true authentic medieval castle, which was always a type of military structure. But that's going into the difference between the neo-Gothic castle and the medieval castle. These are actually two separate, distinct things. Within this video, I've been able to show you the types of rooms you could expect to find within the standard medieval castle. But what about the massive medieval castles, the largest of the large? What type of rooms or layout would you expect to find within them? Well, if you'd like to see a floor-by-floor breakdown of a castle that would have been considered massive within the medieval period, and how the room selection and internal layout can be done, please go watch my video, Principles of Castle Design, Honor Guard Epic Tour and Analysis. And in that video you'll see many of the rooms that were talked about in this video, just contextualized in a finished design. So thank you very much for watching, I hope you have enjoyed, and I hope to see you again. Until that time, farewell.